Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to a Sunday edition of Seen Beyond and Through with Monty. Today, we are going to touch on the very controversial subject of buck breaking. We're going to look at this so-called past practice in slavery to examine whether it's fact or fiction. But before we go on about this very controversial topic that seems to be making a comeback in belief and discussion, I want you to hear this.
And controlling the people.
You had a ship full of African men, women, and children who were at the mercy of the captain and all the sailors on that crew. And those men could have sex with anybody they wanted to. The women, the children, and the men.
You had to see 3 months tied down with these white men. There ain't no women there for the most part. When they start bringing women, they weren't even bringing women. They were bringing girls between the ages of 6 and 15 and raping them all. But they also were raping the men. Same things are happening on the plantation to demasculinize the black man.
Control the slave population is to rape a father in front of his sons, or to take the biggest, baddest black man on the plantation and do something horrible to him, to completely humiliate and emasculate him so that people won't respect him anymore. And that still happens to this day.
In the Caribbean, they had seasoning plantations, which were plantations used to break the slaves. And one plantation, or one place that had a lot of seasoning plantations, was Jamaica. And people have to wonder, what were they doing on these seasoning plantations that was worse than what was happening on the regular plantations? Well, one thing that they were doing on these plantations, especially in Jamaica, they were doing a process called buck breaking, where the white supremacist slave owner or the white supremacist overseer would literally rape black men in front of the whole black population in order to break his spirit, in order to break him down as a man, in order to show dominance against him, in order to show the rest of the black population that this is not your leader. I just made your leader submit to me sexually. And this happened a lot in Jamaica. This is why homosexuality is so looked down upon in Jamaican culture today.
And it was a way primarily of cutting down those who would rebel. In other words, it was a matter of power and control and domination. And they would call it buck busting, but it was really butt busting.
Slavery continued until 1865 for about 2 generations, right? So how do you reconcile that? You can no longer bring in Africans, but you still have the business of slavery. So they still needed Africans to do the work down south, especially after the cotton gin was invented. So you had the creation of breeding farms. 2 of the largest slave breeding farms in the United States were on the eastern shore of Maryland and right outside of Richmond, Virginia. They literally bred black people like cattle. They would have a strong black man have sex with a healthy black woman. That woman could be his mother, his sister, his aunt, his cousin. It didn't matter, because the end product was produce a child that I can sell, bodies that I can sell and ship down to Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina. It was a business.
We had breeding farms in the United States that would put one person from one plantation against another. We even had a system where if you were a breeder, male on one plantation, and a female on another plantation, or even on the same plantation, even if you were mother and son, they would mate you. And so I tell a lot of my patients and a lot of my friends, you got to stop using the MF word, because that was a description of what actually happened when the paper bag would go over the head to put 1 breeder against another when they were related.
1 breeder against another. 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 1 breeder against anot
Okay, so you heard what various people had to say about that topic. And that was from a documentary film which was, I believe, entitled Bug Breaking, that was put together a couple of years ago. Now, this particular subject matter, as I mentioned before, is making a comeback. And we're going to establish if the merits of it are fact or myth. But, I think that I should give you my history with this particular subject, because I first heard about it about 15 years ago. And it was while I was on a desktop computer, a big clunky desktop computer. And I had noticed that the particular meme, the genesis of it, or where it had seemed to have originated, was from a black militant site that was very much anti-gay, anti-LGBTQ. So that was my first encounter with that. And then it died down. Then with, Facebook, social media, IG, other forms, it has made a comeback. And it seemed to me like the small video you seen. By the way, I couldn't play the video because I didn't want to get a copyright strike. So I figured that what I would do with the video is that I'll just let you guys hear what they are saying as opposed to actually playing it. So that's why you didn't see the video. But it's on YouTube. It's called Bug Breaking. Just type it in and you'll get it. So as I stated before, my encounter with this was my first encounter. What I've noticed was that it was from a pro-black militant site that was virulently anti-homosexual in nature. So to understand the origin of that, it has those undertones right there. And we're going to look into this, and you can clearly see that there definitely is very much an anti-gay sentiment that is evolving around this particular topic. Now, it says, at the top left, they're being a little bit sarcastic with it. It says, Master's way of butt breaking in or butt breaking. It goes on to say butt breaking, the process where black men were routinely raped by their gay slave owners. Notice how it emphasizes gay slave owners. What's strange is that when women were raped, they did not say straight slave owners, but they emphasized gay here. Okay, let's go on. Did you know that during slavery in the U.S., gay white slave holders would buy male slaves to engage in forced homosexual sex acts? The black male's child was required to watch front row center so he too can witness his father's sexual demise and humiliation. The slave master would savagely sodomize the buck, aka defiant male slave, in front row, his wife, family, friends, and children. Buck breaking was the slave master's very effective tool in keeping all young black males slaves from ever being defiant and taking revenge. Let's examine this further. I pointed out to you that, they mentioned the term as a slave was being assaulted, or so-called assaulted. They emphasize gay slave owners, but they never emphasized straight slave owners when they were raping other women. Then they go into slave that U.S. gay white slave holders would buy male slaves to engage in forced homosexual sex acts. Okay, the buck child was required to watch front row center. It talked about sexual demise. So basically, what this is saying that to engage in an act like this, to engage in rectal intercourse would be considered a sexual demise. That's the underlying tone right there. The underlying tone. And humiliation. So demise and humiliation is equated with rectal intercourse. Then it goes on to say the slave master would savagely sodomize the buck in front of wife, family, and friends. So once again, it goes on to say savagely sodomize. So with that right there, you can clearly see there is in tone and speech very much an anti-gay agenda that is going on. Here it says buck breaking and sex farms. Okay, here's the problem with this. And the problem with this is that there's some truth to buck breaking and sex farms. Both of them. Buck breaking, before I go on with that, let's just read this. Okay, here's someone who's stating this. There isn't any substantial evidence to support any of these claims. A lot of this is just homophobia and toxic masculinity. Chattel slavery wasn't about sexuality or any slave owner being gay. Sexual abuse itself is about power and having control over people. The practice of buck breaking that they are describing did not exist. How could such a alleged widespread practice, what they went on to say after that, exist without any type of historical documentation, is what they're saying. But I wanted to go back to buck breaking and sex farms and truth and falsehood. Buck breaking, a form of buck breaking did exist in terms of that they would routinely strip men down. They would beat them, flog them in front of family, in front of the plantation, to send out a message that if you did this or if you were defiant, this would happen to you. That type of buck breaking did exist. And oftentimes the slaves will be forced to participate in that particular beatings and torture. Sex farms were very real. Sex farms where they would take the strongest black males, breed them with, it could be mother, it could be their sisters, and they would basically, farms basically, where they would have children, do again, keep creating this process in order to sell them out, or to create a basically a plantation within, a plantation of slaves who can work the fields. That's what the sex farms was about. So, fact and fantasy, yes, that is mixed in with this. Now, buck breaking. Okay, let's read this. A strapping Negro slave who was defiant, surely, and may stir up trouble, was beaten with a whip till bloody in front of his entire slave congregation. The slave owner, deathly afraid of any uprising, would cut down a tree, and with the help of the overseer, would then pummel the defiant buck into submission. Once the slave was worn down, the white master and the other Negro slaves forced him over a tree stump where his breeches would be removed and he laid fully exposed. Okay, ripe for the taking. What came next caused fear and terror to ripple through every slave plantation across the South. The master, drunk on blood and lust, would to all young black men. Let's go back. What came next would cause fears and terror to ripple through every slave plantation across the South. To all strong young black men, that if they do not follow strict orders and comply with the whims of the overseer and the master, this too would be their fate. He removed his own clothing and proceeded to savagely sodomize the buck in front of his wife, family, friends, and children. And then he invited his associates from other plantations to join in the nigger festivities. In order for his plan to take effect, he would require the buck male child to watch front row center, so he can witness his father's sexual demise and humiliation. Buck breaking was the slave master's very effective tool to keep all young black male slaves from ever being defiant and taking revenge. It also triggered the mothers and wives from ever giving consent to an uprising. Buck breaking was so successful that it was made into a sex farm where white men could travel from plantation to plantation, feeding their sadistic homosexual needs. If there was ever any doubt that the white race is their mortal enemy, please remove all doubt and see the truth for what it is. An example of the truth is what it is. Or an example of modern day buck breaking is. So they left this big white blank space right there. And those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. So I don't know if you caught that, but, you know, whoever wrote this meme, they did not know history. They obviously have not really studied anything, because I'm going to break this down and I'm going to show you how false it is. Now, this is not to protect any slaveholder from the past, and not to say that sexual rape, molestation of men, women, and children didn't exist. Because the sexual assault and abuse of men, of women, of children is well documented. That is factual. However, here's where the article falls short in its falsehood. It's stated right here that men would invite, the gay slave owners would invite, or overseers, other men from other plantations to basically participate into this particular practice, or this festivities, or get-togethers, whatever you want to call it. The problem with this is that they did not really study or understand the statutory law of slavery and race in 13th century mainland colonies of British America. Now, this says right here the British colonial origins of anti-gay laws, which are still in effect in British colonies. But the problem with this is this here. Sexual rape and abuse of both men and women did happen. Buck breaking did happen. However, the sexual abuse and rape of men, women, and children was never a public affair. Buck breaking were men, the defiant ones, were whipped. They were beaten. They were tortured. And other slaves were forced to join in. That is true. Anything that's sexual in nature, assaulting, getting naked in front of congregations, was not at all true. Because you must understand that the British colonies back there in antebellum America, British colonies extended way to the Caribbean and Jamaica. They were coming out of Dutch imperial laws. And under Dutch imperial laws, sodomy was against the law. Back in Dutch, If you were convicted of sodomy, you can be beheaded. You can be scalded to death. There is no way that any male back in antebellum America, a white male, regardless of his social standing, would be openly gay. It is foolish to believe that somehow there was this festivities going on where white men, slave owners, would openly, and the operative term there is openly, rape another male slave in front of people. There is no such thing as white gay men getting together back then and inviting other men from other plantations to engage in a same-sex act with another man. Homosexuality would have been looked down upon. It would have been frowned upon. Just like today, where some people have difficulty with it and they feel very much ashamed, he would have been very much ashamed to display his homosexual tendencies or desires. Okay, nothing about this practice, by the way, is written in any historical books. No slave narratives, no slave even wrote about that. There's nothing about any type of male-on-male rape openly. Listen to what I'm saying, people, openly being discussed. Any type of rape or sexual assault would have been done in the private. They would never have done that in front of people. No slaves wrote about it. No historical documentation of it in any of the American colonies. You can't find it anywhere. It is not that it was covered up. If this was so widespread as they were claiming, it would have been written about. Abolitionists would have had a field day with that. They didn't even make this up. Something like that. And, you know, something this widespread, this type of a practice from the Americas to the Caribbeans, it would not have been kept under wraps. It would have been impossible to cover this up. So I think that, you know, apparently people who believe this have not done any type of studying, have not gone over any type of slave text, have not really read about it, obviously. Religious dogma involving same-sex unions was so strong then. It was very strong then that you would have brought ridicule to yourself, to your family, and you would have been subjugated to a long prison sentence and possibly death for being a sodomite. That is the term that was used back then. So we need to be very careful in believing this, things like this, memes that we see online that have a tendency to take a life of their own. And I want to bring up something. Public displays of nudity was not around then. They would never have done that. To even sodomize someone in public, you would have had to have been sadistic. You would have to have enjoyed that. Which, okay, I can give that to, there were definitely sadistic overseers who enjoyed whipping people, who enjoyed flogging people, various forms of torture. I'm going to give you that. But what I would not give you, there would never have been exhibitionists to have sex in front of people, like this article or these beliefs seem to imply, you would have had to have been an exhibitionist. I don't know about you, but I definitely cannot have sex in front of people. That's just not my thing. I mean, I would never be able to get it up. It just is not going to work. And they say buck breaking, okay? If this practice was done. Here's the problem with this. This is going to be a big problem. Gay men know this. That and women too, actually. Because you have straights who participate in anal intercourse, as well as gays. Here's the problem with this. To participate in an act like this, the person must be prepared. They must be properly cleaned out. If they are not, it's going to be a very shitty situation. So what is he going to do? That happens right there. He's going to clean himself up and just go again? That's ridiculous. And they keep stating that it's to their sexual demise, or somehow this one act right there ruined them. There is no proof that that would even work to really stop someone from being rebellious. There's no proof that it's going to be their sexual demise or somehow diminish them as a man, to make them less aggressive or forceful. You can clearly see the anti-gay sentiment with that somehow it's implying that gay men, gay black men who engage in this type of behavior, you're less of a man, you're emasculated, your aggression is taken away, you cannot protect your family in any way, shape, or form, that somehow you've been diminished. So with that, we have to look at an agenda. It is a clear agenda with this meme and with this that is going around. And obviously the agenda is definitely an anti-gay agenda. The agenda is pointed at gay black men, because what it's trying to tell you is that if you are gay, if you participate in these acts, that somehow you're possibly gay because some type of unresolved trauma of buck breaking, that if you do, for those of you who do participate in this, it's dehumanizing to you. You're mentally damaged in some way, that you cannot be a real man. And what's surprising to me is that so many gay black men actually believe in the theory of buck breaking. You know, the evils of slavery were well known, they were widespread. And I guess that another evil act wouldn't be so far-fetched to believe. However, before you start believing in certain things, read first, study first. Do not just believe. Right here's the faith of Roman Catholic Dutch law in the British colonies. You know, I read some of this before, actually, because I mentioned that I came across this like 15 years ago, and I started reading this topic way back then and knew that, no, this is a bunch of bull. It's a bunch of BS. The idea of openly gay, openly raping people, absolutely not. Sodomy laws in 18th century Europe, you can clearly see that if you were to study this, there were sodomy laws that it was against the law. You know, talking about raping people in public, these gay men who would do that, men would even hold hands in public. They wouldn't kiss in public. Surely they're not going to F in public. It goes on to say right here, an examination of trials of rape and sodomy during the 18th century at the old, Bailey in London shows that the treatment of rape was often lenient, with the treatment of sodomy was often severe. However, difficulty in proving that penetration and ejaculation had occurred meant that men were often convicted of the lesser charge of assault with sodomitical intent, which is not a capital offense. Sodomy crimes in England could mean sexually assaulting a young child and could result in sentence of death recorded, i.e. not an actual death sentence at all. In 18th century France, sodomy was still theoretically a capital crime, and there are a handful of cases where sodomites were executed. However, in several of these, other crimes were involved as well. Records from the Bastille and the police lieutenant of Argenson, as well as other sources, show that many who were arrested were exiled, sent to Regiment R, imprisoned in places, generally the hospital, associated with moral crimes such as prostitution. Of these, the number were involved in prostitution or had approached children or otherwise gone beyond merely having homosexual relations. People, you can clearly see that this was a moral thing. It was against the law. It was not something you did back then. Discretion was a key concern for all sides, especially since members of prominent families were sometimes implicated. The law seemed most concerned with those who were the least discreet. Now, it talks about being discreet. Now, this is Europe, but these laws right here extended over to antebellum America and the Caribbean. You would have had to be very discreet to do something like that. Nothing like this was done openly. Even rapes of women, we know that happened all the time. That was done discreetly. It was not done openly. It goes on to say that in 1730, there was a wave of sodomy trials in the Netherlands. Some 250 men were summoned before the authorities. 91 decrees of exile for not appearing. At least 60 men were sentenced to death. People, sodomy, you could have been sentenced to death if openly practiced and openly seen. Why would you want a witness to view you committing an act of sodomy? No one wanted to be deemed a sodomite. And you ever thought that they're making a claim that male slaves who were victimized were somehow dehumanized? That, they had their manliness taken away. Somehow it made them weaker. You ever thought that if slave masters or overseers did that, it would do the exact same thing to them? They would be deemed as weaker, dehumanized. It will make an uprising probably much more likely. It didn't happen, people. Sodomy law in New Netherlands, 1613. These laws and understanding them and reading about them is very important to understand the myth of buck breaking in a sexual form. So buck breaking, fact or fiction? It's fiction. It's a fictional tale. Or I should say buck breaking, fictional in terms of the sexual component to it. Buck breaking of like raping a male slave in front of people, inviting other slave holders or masters to participate. Didn't happen. That absolutely did not happen. Buck breaking in the terms of like flogging, torture, whippings did happen. That did happen very much. Rape, sexual assault happened all the time, but not in the open. That's extremely important to understand that. Nothing sexually was done in the open. So therefore, you can clearly see that with that my first encounter about 15 years ago with this thing was from a militant gay site that had an agenda. It was a anti-gay agenda that's spreading a false meme around that people are reading just something that's just very ridiculous, to be honest with you. And I think that is very dangerous to believe that, because what it does, it's very discriminatory towards gay black men. Not gay white men, but gay black men. And I want to read something to you that someone wrote, and he made a very good point about believing this. Yeah, I do. I do, because it's just ridiculous that people can believe something without reading. And, you know, when I bring this up to gay black men, they get very angry about that and very defensive, because when people have cognitive dissonance, when their belief system is challenged, regardless if it's the truth or not, they don't like it. They want to believe what they want to believe. And why in the hell would you want to believe something that's discriminatory against you? It's just plain old foolishness. But to understand this, I want to read something that someone else wrote. He wrote that one thing that did strike me in trying to figure and trying to find the variations on this meme is that they nearly all make a point of emphasizing, some more than others, homosexuality or gayness in their descriptions. It rather feels to me that there is a presumption being made in the dissemination of this myth that this is somehow a particular and uniquely awful crime beyond the sexual exploitation of black women. And this presumption is not rooted in appreciation of historical dynamics of sexual gender roles, but rather a disapproval of same-sex behavior in general. There is little doubt in my mind that this particular myth has been constructed and disseminated with homophobic thinking and intentions coloring it. It invokes certain stereotypes of modern gay men being predatory and sexually violent, particularly the longer varieties of the myth that appears on some websites. In conclusion then, yes, the meme you have encountered is largely fictionalized, whilst the sexual exploitation of male slaves by white men and women alike was absolutely a real thing, as was the use of ritualistic public humiliations and violence as a means of dehumanization and asserting control. The exact phenomenon this article describes strikes me as being quite fanciful. It is doubtless circulated with the ulterior motive and an agenda in mind, one that is probably tinged with homophobic sentiments. There is no shortage of very real trauma in the historical record when it comes to slavery. These real people who suffered so much injustice do not need to have, nor do they deserve to be demeaned by us inventing more. We should likewise be careful not to impose our own modern ways of thinking unto the people of the past. For similar reasons, as historians, we must try to understand these people somewhat as they understood themselves. Our own ideas about which boxes people should be placed into aren't very useful in doing that. So believing in this does no good at all. What it does, is that it just expands and keeps alive homophobia. And we clearly see that there's that agenda in which they want to achieve. And it's up for people to study to show themselves approved with this. It's such a shame that people are just so willing to believe something because it's online and because it seems correct, because there was so much trauma, there was so much torture, there was so much abuse involved, that if you add something else, it doesn't seem so far-fetched. But when you look deeper and when you study deeper and when you understand the laws back in antebellum America and how British colonies adopted Dutch imperial laws, you can clearly see that no type of sexual practice, sexual rape, humiliation, clothes being taken off, other gay white slave owners or men inviting to participate, was done in a public forum. Well, that, ladies and gentlemen, is another edition of Seen Beyond and Through. And I will see you beyond and through.